I'd like to look at the dominant male bloodlines within the United Kingdom. We have something better than a surname in order to be able to trace our past. We have the Y chromosome that's passed down through the generations from father to son. That's not written on a piece of paper, that's in our bones and in our blood. Let's start out with the most dominant of these bloodlines, the R1Bs. R1Bs make up about 70% of the male population of England, around about 74% of the male population of Wales, and around about 74% to 72% of the male population of Scotland. In Ireland, that's 75%. And if you go down England into Cornwall as well, they become 75%. It's more dominant R1B in this country than in any other place on earth, nearly. There's a big dominance of in areas like the Basque Country in northern Spain as well. But R1B doesn't originate from the Basque Country, doesn't originate from Britain. It comes from the Russian steppe. And it entered Western Europe at the same time as the Indo-European languages entered Western Europe. Came in round about the Middle Bronze Age, and then it started to split. And it split into three sort of main groups there. The first group were the R1B S21s. And they were the Germanic group. They went up into Germany, into Denmark, into southern Scandinavia. The other group sort of stuck together for a time and centered itself around the Alps, where it sort of made its base. It spread out from there as well, especially about 500-600 years before Christ. But even earlier than that, a group of it had split off, and it had gone down into Italy, and it set up a village there that became a little town, and eventually it became a city called Rome. From that Italo-Celtic group, some people decided they were going to go west. They came west and as far as Britain, and they entered Britain, and they became the R1B L21s, the Atlantic Celtic group. So, with such a huge proportion of between 70 to 75% of the British population, depending on where you are, being R1Bs, we're not quite the mongrels that the BBC would like you to believe that we are. Let's start to look at these groups in a little bit more detail then. So we've established that 75% of the DNA, or between 70 and 75% of the DNA in Britain, is either L21, Atlantic Celt, or it's S21, see, I'm remembering the numbers, and that's Germanic, or it's S28, which is Italo-Gallic. Let's look at R1B L21 first. R1B L21s have been in Britain for an awful long time. As can be seen, they dominate the gene pool of Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Cornwall, but they're also the most dominant group in England too. Their ancestors have been in England on a male line that is unbroken for well over 3,000 years. In round about 500 years before Christ, the L21 Atlantic Celts were joined by their cousins, the S28s. They'd been living around the Alps for quite some time, and they brought a new metal with them. They brought iron. There may have also been a little bit of iron in Britain before that time, but these people are really what we imagine Celts to be. They come from the Latin and the Hallstatt cultures. Let's look at some of the artwork that they created. These people were some of the most advanced abstract thinkers in the world. They were never large in number, and today their haplogroup S28 is round about 10% of the people of East Anglia. It drops off to 5% of people in sort of eastern and southern Britain, right the way down to Cornwall. It's about 5%. As you head off towards Wales, it drops to 1%. And in West Wales, there are virtually no S28s at all. But their culture spread there. Their cousins adapted and adopted the iron weapons that the S28s had brought with them, and many other advances as well. There was one set of cousins yet to be reunited with their Celtic kin, and that was the R1b S21s, the Germanic group. They weren't going to number as large or dominate the gene pool as largely as L21, the Celtic group. However, their culture would become dominant. With them, they brought the language that we speak. In fact, their culture was so dominant that not only did it dominate this island, it dominated the world. 30% of the population of England, the male population of England, are R1b S21s. And the vast majority of those will be of Anglo-Saxon descent. I've already stated that the Roman Empire didn't have a huge genetic input into Britain. In fact, it had a very, very small, minute footprint in Britain. The Anglo-Saxon invasion had a far larger impact. It's also worth noting as well that the majority of Danish Vikings would have also been S21s. The majority of Norman French would have also been S21s. It's interesting then, if you go over to Ireland, that people with Norman names in Ireland, and there are a lot of them, have a high propensity of S21 Germanic haplogroup, whereas those that do not are very much predominantly L21. And so it was that in Britain, the family of L1b that had split 2,000 years before Christ was reunited. And I happen to think they made a pretty good country at the end of it. Oh, you're asking yourselves now, okay, we know what 70 to 75% of the British population are. The 70 to 75% of the British male population are R1b Indo-Europeans. Okay, how about the rest? Well, a large proportion of them are haplogroup I. And haplogroup I has been in Europe virtually forever. It's can be associated with the cave paintings in the Cro-Magnons in France. In England, depending on what study you've got, they say it's about 18% of the population are haplogroup I. That's about 12% in Cornwall, but there are areas of Essex where this goes up to about 38%. 11% of Scots, 17% in the Scottish Isles. Well, the Scottish Isles were invaded and occupied by large numbers of Vikings. So the Vikings brought haplogroup I into the country as well. But there would have been one strand of haplogroup I that was here anyway, that would have survived. These I's are the great survivors. There are less of them in Wales, there's about 8%. But they're the ones that make up the other big chunk of the gene pool there. There are smaller groups around. Haplogroup J started out in Arabia and Mesopotamia and comes into Europe with Neolithic farming. It's quite common around Greece, Italy, southern Europe. It's about 3 to 5% in England and less in Wales. There's E1b, which I suppose could be a Semitic type of haplogroup, which is in North Africa and the Middle East. And that makes up about 1 to 5% of the English population as well. But it's rarely found in South Wales, Northern Scotland, or Cornwall. That too would have probably come in with the Neolithic farmers. G, which has its origins on the eastern Black Sea, is less than 1% of the population of Britain. And T is so minute that it can't really be given a percentage. It's an haplogroup that's common in East Africa. Thomas Jefferson had the T haplogroup. And then we have to start questioning, why did Thomas Jefferson, of British origins, have this East African haplogroup? I think it comes down to the Roman Empire. And I'd like to discuss that and its genetic impact on Britain in a little bit more detail. Recent genetic studies have found that the Roman Empire had very little genetic impact upon Britain. In fact, so little that it's difficult to measure it. So why did it have such little impact? It controlled this country for 400 years. There were a lot of legionaries here, all of that type of thing. They should have had more of an impact. Well, the first factor is, if it had an impact, would you have been able to measure that anyway? Because the majority of the legions that came to Britain came from Germania and Spain and the Alpine region. They would have had genetics in common with the Latine and the Hallstatt Celts that had come to Britain earlier. The elite in Rome would have had genes very close to the Hallstatt Celts. They interbred within that elite, and they came from that Celto-Italic group. These were the people that had set up Rome there. There are a couple of other factors as well. Rome was as much a franchise. A lot of these people that wandered around with togas, Tacitus is quite clear that the British were very quick to wear togas. The rich British were set up in villas and set up into a class there. So these people that called themselves Roman, a lot of them came from the native population anyway. Immigration from the Roman Empire would have centred around the cities. When the English came to this country, you have monks like Gildas telling us certainly the way that we behaved when we first came. It was slaughter, rape, enslavement. We drove a lot of these people out. A lot of them went over to the continent. The fact that these people were centred in towns means that townspeople were probably more likely to move off than country farmers. They didn't have that attachment to the country, that attachment to the land. So we can look at the Roman Empire as having an impact on Britain in a similar way to the British Empire had on India. It had a huge cultural impact on Britain, but it didn't have a huge genetic impact. It didn't have anywhere near the impact that it had in places like France or Spain. How much control did it ever really have over this island? Hadrian's Wall marked its northern boundary. They went up to the Antonine Wall at some point. Wales, did it really control Wales, or did it just control the forts there? Did it really control the marshes of England, or did it just control the outside part of it? The Romans moved off. And the BBC is always very keen to push this fact that we've all been a multicultural country. And they have pictures of Roman families there and of people from Africa and people from the Balkans and all these things coming to this country. And in small numbers, they did. And the BBC always gets very, very excited when a new sort of uncommon Y haplogroup is found in Britain, because it pushes that multicultural sort of agenda. And there are these little clusters of people. There's a surname, Revis, in Yorkshire, that's associated with an A1 haplogroup that started out in Africa. But it's only a very, very small number of people there. there's the Thomas Jefferson haplogroup that I discussed earlier, that may well have come to Britain with the Roman Empire and survived in a small pocket. Let's look at the number of people that actually have that T haplogroup, though. I mean, it's extremely small for native British men is an underestimation. Out of 85 British men with the surname Jefferson, if I can go through this, 2 of them had that T group there. Not quite as multicultural as the BBC would like to have us. But on these uncommon haplogroups, there is another group that's quite interesting as well. Because if I'm reading down the list down here, and Abergele in Wales, 33% of the males in Abergele come from haplogroup E. I don't think that had anything to do with the Roman invasion. That has got to do with Neolithic farmers. Let's talk about those in a little bit more detail too. Anywhere you go in Britain, you will find evidence of the monolith culture, right the way from Orkney in Scotland down to Stonehenge. And this was all part of the Neolithic farming culture, people that came to this country with haplogroup J and E. And if you would have come back to this country 2,000 years before Christ, you would have found that the majority of people in this country, I believe, the majority of men in this country would have been haplogroup E and J. So what happened to them? Well, they were weakened by a catastrophe, and then they had the R1Bs descend upon them. And the R1Bs became the dominant men. And dominant men take resources, and one of those resources that dominant men take are women. Women find dominant men attractive. The E's and J's would have been reduced to lower levels in society. They would have been killed or enslaved. And over generations, their numbers would have decreased. That's human nature. It's very much human nature today as much as it was then, even though we have laws that control us and that hold us back. These E's that survived in Abergele, well, if you go to Wales, you'll find it's a very mountainous region. So a little cluster of them survived there. It brings on to another point, though, and to another video that I want to work on. And that's that the female line shows a different picture, a different aspect of history to the male line. I have to put another statement in here now that really, when I'm making these videos, I'm talking about the native people of this country, the white British people. And things have changed more in the last 50 years, and probably the last 20 years than they ever have before in our history. Well, since the Norman conquest, there have been groups of immigrants coming to this country. I have 4% Jewish ancestry, and they came in about 200 years ago. And is immigration on that level a bad thing? Well, I don't think it is, because it adds to the gene pool, it brings in new ideas. It can be very positive. Today, white British people are a minority in London. There are more people of Pakistani descent in Birmingham than there are white British people. And the demographics in schools show that that's going to increase. And certainly within this century, the white British will become a minority in the country as a whole. My worry is that we're going to lose the culture. And it's a culture that I love. It won't be the first time the culture's changed in this country. When the English came, the culture changed as well. The language that was spoken here from pre-Roman times, and it shows the impact that the Romans had, because unlike France, which adopted a Latin language, Spain, which adopted a Latin language, Britain kept its Celtic language. But very little of that Celtic language survived into modern day English. There are very few words there. But yet, there are more men in England with L21 haplogroup, the Celtic haplogroup, than there are with the Germanic haplogroup, S21. Why isn't there more of that Welsh surviving there? And I believe that comes down to the English class culture. A couple of centuries ago, you would have spoken French to show how elevated in society you were. Well, in the Dark Ages, you'd have spoken English, and you wanted to be associated with English. And you didn't want to be associated with the Welsh people that were being dominated in parts of England. That changed when people went west. At some point in the Dark Ages, probably in the 5th century, there was a huge battle at a place called Baden. It's associated with King Arthur. Ambrosius Aurelius was another figure there. That battle was so large that it stopped the English expansion over this country for 50 years. The genetics of England are affected by that as well, because I personally believe that you can draw a line down there, and from the one side of that line you find a lot more of that Celtic L1 Y haplogroup, and the other side of it you find more of the Germanic S21. People moan sometimes and they say that the history is always taught about battles. Well, battles is around male dominance, and that has a huge impact upon culture. It's had a huge impact upon this country. But the majority of us are R1b Indo-Europeans. And if we look at the poem Beowulf and then compare that to Welsh stories at the time, particularly from the Anarian in southern Scotland, which was written in Welsh because the people spoke Welsh up there, and you're talking about the way in which these people behaved in the mead hall, there was a huge similarity in culture there. I love this country very much, and I hope that's represented in my writing. And if you'd like to take a look at my writing, I'll leave a link below. It's not really about DNA. I write about Anglo-Saxons and about Celts. I write, I believe, a little bit more eloquently than I speak, and I don't overuse the word there. Thank you very much for listening. If you like the video, please subscribe. Thanks again.